Okay, thank you all. And thanks for sticking with us to the end. I'm not seeing the usual sort of trickle down of attendees as the day progresses. So that's a good sign, I think. So the last panel here, we want to look a bit more at the question of how online behaviors impact real world or so-called offline behaviors, and maybe even also the other way around, which is kind of been one of the big questions from the start of anyone's research on, the role of online activity and how it actually impacts people's behavior. It's been one of the first questions that was asked when people started researching this. So we're now in a place where there's quite a bit more data and ability to analyze this. And in fact, that's partly thanks to the people up on this stage here. So I'm going to introduce them in the order they're going to speak. So first we'll have Ryan Scrivens. He's the assistant professor of criminal justice at Michigan State. He's going to talk to us about the connections between online and offline behaviors of right-wing extremists. You may know his work. He's an incredibly prolific journal article producer. I got to say, I wish I could do half the amount that he's doing. Those things are not easy. Like those things are not easy to write and publish. So it's very impressive. After that, we have Clara Jammot, who is a PhD student here at King's, the War Studies Department. Her research examines the ties between international security and technology. And she'll be looking at the manosphere, and particularly the question of identifying, who are the actual extremists within this, and who is not, and how we can kind of understand where the extremist activism is and how to identify it. After that, we have Jessica White, who's here next to me, Assistant Director of Terrorism and Conflict Research at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. She'll be looking at the online gaming spaces and the dynamics, again, there of the offline and online sociocultural identity formation. And finally, Milo Comerford, Director of Policy and Research at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue here in London. He'll be presenting their research on the connection between a kind of recent wave of teenage ISIS supporter plots and attacks in Europe, and this sort of cross-platform ISIS support ecosystem, which still manages to survive even on the kind of mainstream platforms that we kind of sometimes assume they've been removed from. They still have found ways, and I think thanks to his research and that of others like Mustafa Ayad, they still have some pretty, they're ingenious but also simple methods of staying on YouTube, right, or staying on these places where we'd think it would be very difficult to do. So with that, we'll go to Ryan. Go ahead. Yeah, I'll bring you the, sorry. You mind passing that now? Thank you.
That's great. Thanks everybody for being here today. I also want to thank the organizers. They've really put on an excellent event.
I promised it was going to work.
They've still put on an excellent event. All right, so I was asked today to talk about connecting the on and offline behaviors of right-wing extremists. And
we're good, yes.
If I can't change it, I'll just ditch it. But just to provide a little bit of background. So in recent years, many researchers, practitioners, and policymakers have paid particularly close attention to the presence of violent extremists and terrorists online, largely to gauge the on and offline links related to behaviors. Here, the emphasis has largely been on the digital patterns and behaviors of violent right-wing extremists. And such behavior or such attention has largely been the result of ongoing reports that some violent right-wing extremists and terrorists were active online prior to their attacks offline. A couple fairly recent notable examples: Breivik, who killed 77 in a bombing attack, mass shooting in 2011 in Norway, was a registered member of a white supremacy forum and also had ties to far-right social media sites. Dylan Roof killed 9 in a mass church shooting in 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, who allegedly posted messages on an extremist site, as well as hosted his own extremist site containing his alleged manifesto. sure many of you are, some of you are here today because of the likes of Tarrant, who in 2019 killed 51 in a mosque mass shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, or a series of shootings. He live streamed his attack online, as well as announced his intentions and produced a manifesto online there too. And then you have the Buffalo shooter who killed 10 in a supermarket shooting. He live streamed parts of attacks online, as well as wrote and posted manifesto citing the so-called Great Replacement theory, conspiracy theory. So it's pretty clear that, or it should be understandable to most, that attention has been paid to identifying these types of users online prior to their violence offline, and then scrutinizing their online presence, essentially connecting the on and offline worlds and their behaviors. Here, oftentimes the question historically has been around the influence of an offender's consumption of. Yeah, I'm going to ditch the slides. Here, questions are often asked around the influence of an offender's consumption of and networking around violent extremist online content, and accepting their extremist ideologies, and particularly in their decision to engage in violent extremism and terrorism offline. But what does the empirical literature actually tell us related to the connection between the on and offline behaviors of right-wing extremists? So there have been several studies done, not a lot myself. I've done extensive work, I guess, on the violent and non-violent extremists, right-wing extremists, looking at their online behaviors. There's been others looking at manifestos, like Will's in the room right now, Julie Ebner. I've also done some work interviewing right-wing extremists, violent right-wing extremists on their internet use. There's also been others like Paul Gill, Tom Holt, Holbrook and Taylor, looking at consumption of extremist content before engaging in violence. So what I'm going to present now are largely my findings, but they are linked to other research as well. Some of the key kind of themes that I've found in understanding the connection between the on and offline behaviors of violent right-wing extremists. The first is this idea of modified online behavior. So my research and others suggest that right-wing extremists who we've worked with, I guess, seem to be largely concerned about their on and offline security, noting that they actually modify their on and offline behaviors to avoid detection and infiltration from law enforcement and anti-fascist groups. They may, for example, post very little. They may post in ways that they perceive aren't public, like some of you probably heard of internet cafes. Back in the day, some folks were using that, DMing, getting others to post for them. And this is interesting because despite these security concerns, the people I've interviewed and what the research suggests is that a lot of these individuals, the violent right-wing extremists, will maintain the same identities on and offline. To present to others that they're a leader or they're a recruiter in the movement, because what they were oftentimes concerned with were what they called net Nazis or internet warriors, loudmouths essentially online, who they despised. So these individuals weren't, so the violent right-wing extremists weren't particularly active online, but when they were active, they weren't afraid to, like, obviously not give their address, but like make it clear that they're a leader of a violent racist skinhead group. The next key pattern that we've been finding are around this idea of a low profile poster. So this research finds that it's actually the non-violent right-wing extremists, not the violent extremists, who display more potentially threatening online behaviors that law enforcement intelligence may deem worthy of further exploration. So the non-violents tend to post more messages, and the content of their posts would suggest that they may be more extreme. They're posting with more indicators of extremism. They're posting more ideological content. They're trying to mobilize people to violent extremism. What my work suggests is these individuals may define themselves as the political type, where they think that they're the ideologues. They post a larger proportion of ideological content that can then be taken up by the violent faction. And they see this as a conceptual tool, and that's how they perhaps perceive themselves in the extremist movement. But much more work is needed in this space. So together then, a primary focus for law enforcement intelligence should be on these low profilers. They are maybe the violent users. And it's important also to point out a recent work by Brown indicates that expressing extremist views alone does not signal mobilization to offline action, whether it's violence or not. Like I believe Yannick mentioned earlier, we don't know intent of these individuals. We don't know capacity, motivation, time, space, so on and so forth. But at any rate, a third pattern in the data that we've identified relates to these online persisters. So people who continue to post messages. What the research shows is that most right-wing extremists in this research space, at least, regardless of whether they're violent or not, tend to actually persist in their online behaviors. So in other words, they don't tend to desist in behavior. So they don't stop posting. They could post over time with less frequency, but they still continue to post on these platforms. And what's also been found is it's the non-violent extremists who are more likely to persist in posting behavior than the violent right-wing extremists. And this finding to some extent comes as a surprise because research overwhelmingly finds, including mine, not looking at the violent, non-violent, that most people tend to tail off or desist or stop posting in online spaces over time. Yet this work, looking at the specific samples of violent, non-violent users, suggests that this group are at least continuing to post over time, which aligns with other research. Some researchers have called right-wing extremist online spaces hornet's nests, or conceptualizing these spaces as polarizing platforms where people post more. It's hard to say why we're finding more online persisters, but perhaps the persisters in our data were embedded in right-wing extremist groups offline, and in turn, they thought that they had a greater stake in participating in online discussions to recruit or grow their movement offline. But again, this finding requires further exploration. The next relates to these unassuming desister posters. So our research finds that violent desisters, so the violent desisters are generally the low profile posters. So they may be tailing off or stopping posting over time, but they generally aren't posting a lot, whether it's posting messages in general or ideological messages. But what's striking is that as they desist or if they're slowly tailing off and then stopping posting, that's when they start to post a lot of messages trying to mobilize others to violent extremism. That's pretty interesting, I think. So what we find here is they also become more active online in general and in posting mobilization messages specifically as they tail off of posting. So they're kind of quiet. They're relatively low profile, but near the end, we don't know why they're tailing off and desisting. It's like a last-ditch effort. We don't really know why this is the case, but some suggest maybe they went to prison. Maybe some suggest that they're just taking full advantage before they go to prison. But again, this is something that requires further exploration. This research is very underdeveloped. How am I doing for time? Okay. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, the last key theme before I very briefly talk about where we're at or what the research doesn't tell us are these opportunistic posters. Striking was the extent to which the violent right-wing extremists, not the non-violent, tried to mobilize people to violent extremism during peak posting days. So days that generate the most user buzz. So we broke down the data by frequencies and found the top, I can't remember the number of days that had the highest posting frequencies. And that was the day that actually those were the days that the violent users were trying to mobilize others to violent extremism. Again, this idea of just trying to take advantage when they can. This is certainly a question for policy experts that should be investigated further, and we can talk about this more. But lastly, I don't want to take up too much time. What does the research not tell us? Sample sizes generally aren't great. They're small. With my research, it's been a sample of 99 users. Other studies have been 26 users, 10 interviews, 9 manifestos, 15 manifestos. Future research is certainly needed for a more robust sample. A lot of these analyses, with some exceptions, recent ones, tend to be limited to samples of postings from one online space. Future research is certainly needed for comparisons across platforms. And such analyses would certainly provide practitioners and policymakers with the needed insight into the extent to which behaviors are unique to specific sample groups or are unique to specific platforms. We don't know. And the last is around this idea of data. So you can probably tell I'm talking in relatively general terms. Our data does not include key characteristics on these users that we define or characterize as violent or non-violent. The literature that looks at the offline behaviors of these individuals have data on these violent or non-violent users' employment status, criminal records, history of mental illness, radicalized peers, grievances, so on and so forth. We don't have that. These are key characteristics that may be driving the differential posting behavior. And lastly, I'll just say that I think it'd be really interesting and tricky to do. Future research should essentially pinpoint exact moments in time that individuals engage in violence offline, as well as the kind of violence and the motivations and the victims, and then assess the posting patterns both before and after that act. Doing so may shed light on whether specific posting patterns online escalate to violent action offline and vice versa. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan. Go ahead, Clara.
Thank you very much for having me here today. So as Alexander mentioned, I'm a PhD student at King's, and my topic essentially studies the connection between algorithms and the sense of self in TikTok users. So looking specifically at the masculinist extremist communities, aka communities in the manosphere. And so today, drawing from my research, I'd like to discuss the decentralization of radicalization that is taking place on the manosphere, which in turn is arguably reducing the need for a single extremely violent narrative and instead allows for radicalization through a combination of multiple quote unquote softer narratives. So in order to understand the shift from a single radicalizing narrative to more multiple radicalizing narratives, it's important to understand the transition of masculinist ideology from offline to online. So masculinism, or anti-feminist ideology, which believes that feminism should be eradicated and women are the cause of men's problems, has always been fragmented, even when it was online and in the early days of the internet. Because albeit operating under the common banner of masculinism, different groups had different interpretations of the ideology. And you may have heard of some of these groups: pickup artists, men going their own way, men's rights movements, fathers' rights groups, and later, of course, involuntary celibates or incels. And so these groups did definitely overlap, but they held distinctions. A pickup artist could become an incel and vice versa, but at the same time, a pickup artist was not an incel. But by moving online, and more specifically by experiencing a new mode of content consumption that we all now see on our social media platforms, these distinctions between these groups have blurred much more, to the point where they're arguably now being redefined, as the manosphere structures itself according to thematic distinctions rather than ideological ones. So what do I mean by a thematic distinction? Well, a thematic distinction is essentially just a content niche or a content category. And in my research where I was scraping TikTok, I ended up kind of clustering the masculinist posts into what generally fell into four main content niches: the male mental health and loneliness niche, financial advice and lifestyle goals, motivation and grind encouragement, and finally dating. Now, because these are focused on content rather than specific groups and ideologies, they already change how individuals engage with extremist content. But then from these content niches, I noticed that there were two big categories of actors that were driving this decentralization further and even influencing how the extremist narratives were being sold. The first actor category is what I call the small scale accounts, which are very specific to the dating niche because there's kind of a lack of a truly dominant influencer in the dating category. You don't have a Jordan Peterson, you don't really have an Andrew Tate anymore. And so instead, what you have are many interchangeable accounts that all copy and paste the same video format, the most popular being the street interview, where young men will go interview couples or groups of young women in bar districts, where interviewees subsequently often being a little drunk. As such, these videos then push narratives that women lie, women cheat, women manipulate. And these echo the original masculinist ideas of women manipulate the world and they want to oppress men. However, even though they echo the explicit violence of early masculinism, we're already seeing a softening in the sense that these concentrate on the relationship rather than society as a whole. However, the actor that has really served to soften the masculinist radicalization process and decentralize it is the manosphere influencer, which was a lot more present in the mental health, finance, and motivation niches. Now, to understand how the manosphere influencer actually decentralizes the manosphere rather than centralizes it, we need to go back to 2022, where Andrew Tate was the king of the manosphere, at least according to mainstream media. So what I've come to realize in my research is that Tate is this really interesting turning point in masculinist radicalization. Because on the one hand, Tate modernized masculinism. He brought a lot of new ideas and he blended all of these different groups in his rhetoric. He was discussing incel ideas, pickup artist ideas, but also finance ideas and entrepreneurship and the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps ideas. But while he was pushing the thematic rather than the ideological focus, he retained an almost old school approach because he was just so popular that he was the central hub of extremist content. If you went down the radicalization pipeline of the manosphere, inevitably you would come across Tate at one point or another. So once Tate was deplatformed, essentially removing that central hub, it created a vacuum where various smaller scale influencers were able to come in, but they only picked up one or two of the topics that he had been discussing. One good example of this is Jordan Peterson, who arguably is not that small an influencer. But while he does discuss a range of topics, he is arguably most specialized in the male mental health, male loneliness discussions. And so with all these smaller influencers, it's given rise to what I call the networked approach to radicalization, where users now have a menu of influencers and content themes to choose from. It's a build your own radicalization pipeline format rather than a common process. So not only did this menu of influencers decentralize the manosphere, but it also changed the anti-woman rhetoric. Because since these top influencers were specializing in a particular niche, the focus is on the niche itself, and the anti-woman content is the byproduct. Ashton Hall is a great example of this. Some of you might know Ashton Hall, who went viral a few months ago for his morning routine, which included rubbing banana peels on his face. Now, Hall, of course, would not say that he is promoting extremism, and his videos technically aren't. But at the same time, in each video, a faceless woman hands him his meals, his clothes, and everything else that he might need, promoting a rather submissive vision of women. And so Hall, whether he wants to or not, inherently participates in the underlying anti-woman narratives of the finance lifestyle goal niche, which generally either say in a hostile manner, women are gold diggers who exploit men financially, or per the Hall approach is a lot more benevolent and says, if you have the right woman by your side, you'll be successful financially. Of course, both of these still hold a certain vision of the woman, especially what a right woman is. There's submission. In some cases, there's even racialized elements that tie into white supremacy. But overall, these narratives are less violent than incel discussions about legalizing rape and female concentration camps. And this trend occurs throughout all four content niches that I've come across. So these two groups, the influencers and the small scale accounts, create a masculinist framework that is still arguing that women are at fault and that feminism needs to be eradicated. But at the same time, we're providing multiple narratives as to why women are at fault with a much broader range of voices. So what does this decentralization mean when we want to deal with radicalization? And these will be my kind of three concluding points. The first is that as the online space reduces the centrality of actors, it becomes a lot harder to track where radicalization is coming from. We have a lot more entry points nowadays into the radicalizing process with a much broader range of interests to consider, even just on TikTok, let alone across all of the social media platforms. So that does make it more complex. Then secondly, with this broader range of interests, it's increasingly difficult to draw the line about what is and isn't extremist content. I think we can all agree that a workout influencer is technically not an extremist or a terrorist. But when the workout influencer is telling you, remember how your girlfriend cheated on you and how she sucks, and draw that into your winter arc to become a better man, and then we can start asking questions about, is it extremism? So it means we need a lot more nuance, which also means it takes more time to identify and deal with extremist content. And for the platforms hosting that content, it also means a lot more questions about free speech, what is acceptable, what isn't, what is extremist, what isn't. And so finally, this decentralization and softening of the narrative makes extremist ideologies so much more accessible to the general population. If we look back at the early narrative, women rule the world and want to oppress men, but actually doesn't really sell very well. You're targeting 50% of the global population. And if you take, for example, a white supremacist, they might be able to avoid interacting with racial minorities because of their extremist ideology. But a masculinist has a much harder time avoiding any connection with women ever. So that definitely complicates the ability to argue that all women want to oppress you, even your mom. So instead, a combination of much more digestible narratives where violence is implicit rather than explicit do a much better job at getting extremist messages out there. So finally, it's important to review how we're addressing masculinism and these massive gaps that we're currently leaving by only focusing on the most violent of violence and only discussing incels, when the reality is a lot broader and a lot more nuanced. To fail to recognize these nuances and how radicalization in the manosphere is changing is to fail at helping the young women and men that are being impacted by that radicalization. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to Jessica now. We'll try the slides again one more time. I think it's mostly a delay on the.
All right, I'll get going while it's coming up. You have a magic spot where you pointed this, Aaron. There you go. All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for having me. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Thank you, Belle. Let me ask this. How many gamers do I have in the room? Okay, a fair amount of hands. How many people have a game on their phone of some sort? Scrabble, number game, some kind of game. Most people probably have something on their phone. Yeah. There's a distinction, right, between how we can, those who raise their hands for me asking how many gamers do I have in the room versus people who play games. This is an interesting distinction because gamer identity is something that I'm going to talk about. And sort of the research that we've been doing the last few years looks at this gaming world in the sense of looking at it as a social space, as a community space. So it's research that we've been doing for several years, and we've just finished a project, which I'll talk you through here. Some of you might have heard me talk about this before, so hopefully I'm not repeating too much of it. But I think it's worth starting at the beginning for those of you who are not gamers. Now, any real gamer will know the minute I open my mouth, I am not a real gamer. However, I have studied this long enough to know reasonably well what I am talking about. Lucy, I maybe don't need to introduce Think Tank. I run a team that looks at terrorism and conflict dynamics. So we look at a lot wider range of counterterrorism issues, but we several years ago helped to launch what we call the Extremism in Gaming Research Network, which is a group of people. GNET has kindly partnered with us on many things, and a group of people looking at either coming more from the gaming side and the gaming industry side, or people looking at countering extremism in gaming spaces. So this network very specifically focuses on all things gaming. And it was a group of people, group of researchers from this network that made up the project team for the project that I'll talk you through here in a second. Maybe for those non-gamers in the room, it's worth doing a little primer on why this is important to talk about. Gaming is a big industry. It's bigger than any other entertainment industry. The number of money figure surprises at least policymakers who aren't aware of games. 184 billion, that's old figure to 2023. So it's higher now. It keeps getting higher each year. A lot of money passes through this industry, and because of its popularity, it is now very much part of pop culture. So it's lunchbox stickers and water bottle, sort of pictures, and all of these things often include references to popular games. There are, of course, a wide variety of games available. Some of them are AAA titles that millions of people play. Some of them are tiny, tiny ones that 30 or 40 people play. There's a huge distinction. The gaming industry is a huge industry. Many of our tech friends in the room have tech companies that are involved across social media platforms and games and all these other online spaces. So there are specific companies that do only games, but many companies that do everything plus games. It's often a sort of a media moral panic when we have attackers who reference games in their manifestos, that suddenly the games have come into the limelight of being the source of radicalization for some of these attackers. It usually comes up in discussion after these events. I will say that millions, if not billions of people play games and have a very positive experience. So it's not that we are suggesting that the violence in video games causes violence, or the radicalization that the radicalization influences that you might be exposed to in games will cause radicalization any more amplified than any other space. But it's a space where a lot of people spend time. Over 3 billion people now spend time in gaming spaces. So it's certainly a place that we need to think of, and we need to think of it as a community space. And I'll say, why are we talking about games? And it's because games present a very powerful experience and a social experience that's different to just exchanging information, receiving information in a social media environment, right? So people who are not gamers won't have this experience. But if you, let's say you go and you play a game, and the goal of the game is to go and slay the dragon. So if you join an online game with multiple players, you won't know them necessarily, right? But if you join this game and this group of people happens to be really good at helping you slay the dragon, then suddenly you have a shared community experience that has helped you achieve a goal. And that immediately lowers your sort of social instinct it lowers the threshold of trust, right? You want to be in with this group of people because they're good at helping you achieve the goal of the game. So if you want to be in with this group of people, much like peer dynamics and offline spaces, then you are going to be more willing to adopt what their worldviews might be. And if that group of people happens to be a racist, sexist, whatever, discriminatory group of people, that can then expose you to many, many influences that might lower your resilience to radicalization or to approaches for recruitment or whatever it might be. So it's the social aspect of gaming that we really wanted to look at for the purposes of this project, to think about what is it about socialization in these spaces that we really need to consider, and then how can we better prevent that? Because as we all know, with trust and safety and the wider world of the internet, you can remove content all day long. There will always be somebody there to put it back. So how can we reinforce what could be a sort of a bottom-up approach to protecting gamers, protecting people who spend time in gaming spaces? It's worth me just clicking through these quickly to say that online harms are increasing, right? The presence of hateful, hate-based, radicalizing extremist content is increasing across online spaces. These are several studies that are available that sort of reference what types of hate-based content or extremist content you can find, where you can find it, that the numbers are going up. So the project that we did asks a set of questions, and this is how it sort of relates to the online-offline point, because the project that we did wanted to ask about, one, exposure to hate-based content and to extremist content in gaming spaces, but two, when people are forming their gaming identities, how much of your offline identity do you bring with you to that online identity? This is something that hadn't really been looked at before in the context of gaming, because gamer identity is a powerful thing. And if you ask some people who are real gamers who spend 8 hours a day in a gaming space, their gaming identity is more real to them than their offline, or if you want to call it real life identity. Their real life takes place in their game experience. It's their primary identity. So if you have people who are forming these identities in online spaces, how much of your offline identity factors do you bring with you? So we looked at this through a gender lens, through an intersectional lens, and really asked questions about it. Do people bring their offline gender identity with them to their gamer identity? Do they apply their offline religious identity or their offline age or their offline cultural influences to how they build up who they are in these gaming spaces? And if they do, does that then interact with or contribute to hate-based discrimination in gaming spaces, or how you might spend time, or the communities that you might choose to join in gaming spaces? And it was an interesting exercise. And I think the answer we came up with was yes, people do bring their offline identity to gaming spaces. We looked at 7 countries. Let's see which slide am I on? Yeah, we looked at 7 countries. We tried to get some geographic diversity, some language diversity in those 7 countries. And we asked a lot of questions about identity factors and what sort of experience people had had while spending time in gaming spaces, what experiences they'd had about being subject to hate-based discrimination, about even inflicting hate-based discrimination, and how much that had factored into where they chose to spend time in games, what communities they had joined, what communities they had left, and sort of whether they had been approached by people who might be trying to recruit them, or whether or not they had been exposed to more radicalizing content. Now, you might say there's a little bit of challenge in this, right? Because we're talking about two things that are closely connected, but legally not overlapping when we're talking about hate-based discrimination and hate-based harm and extremist content. Thank you. In this study, we did ask more generally about hate-based discrimination than we did about terrorist ideologies, specifically naming ideologies, because with people who don't study ideology all the time like we do, a lot of those terms are irrelevant. They don't know what they mean. They don't know what they refer to. So there is some distinction to be had and some distinction needed in what we talked about. But overall, the study found that the rates of exposure to extremist content or to hate-based discriminatory content are very high. These surprise some people. I doubt they surprise people in this room, but they surprise other people who are not as familiar. 30–40% of people are exposed to either videos, images, symbols, other types of radicalizing contents, 25 exposed to recruitment specific contents. The numbers of hate-based discriminatory, that experience is even higher, 75% almost of people who had some kind of exposure to hate-based discrimination. So you mix all that together and you start to see how consistent exposure to this type of hate-based, sexist, racist environments can lower social group resilience to radicalization and to recruitment attempts in these groups. So the more time you spend online, the more likely you are to come across this type of content. These are just some images that we pulled in sort of the gathering of content that we collected. And your cultural background, your cultural influences also impact how you receive and respond to this type of content we found. So there was different levels of willingness to respond, different levels of willingness to report, and that all linked back to sort of the cultural prevalence of this type of behavior and how you might respond in your offline culture would influence how you would respond in your online culture. So to wrap up, I think it's important to say that a lot of times we do this kind of research and we look at online spaces, we look at radicalization influences in online spaces, and we forget that it's important to look at it with a gender lens and an intersectional lens. And we forget that people are individuals and have an individual identity experience as part of this wide world of online hate and harm that we all look at. So the main point I hope to send you away with is that what we learned is that online identity is closely linked to offline identity. People have offline gendered identities, people have offline, racial identities, age identities, all these things they bring with them to the online space. And it's as practitioners who are trying to counter harms and radicalization in online spaces, we have to take that into account and consider that. And certainly trust and safety and all these people that are working to moderate contents, they need better understanding and training around how to factor that into what they are also trying to do, because it's not a well understood aspect and it's not a well researched aspect of this type of content in these spaces. This is a link in case you want to pull up any of the reports. They're all available now from the project. There's a long report and then also a toolkit. If anybody is working on online sort of PCVE in gaming spaces, there's a toolkit as well.
Thank you, Justice. Yep. And finally, Milo, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here and to join such a great group of speakers. I am here representing my inimitable ISD colleague, Mustafa Ayad, whose research really underpins this presentation. So unfortunately, we have to excuse a lack of 90s hip hop references, which you'd have been getting full on if he was able to join us today. So as Alex teed up earlier, we've been asked to focus a little bit on some of ISD's research on the phenomenon of teenage terrorism and some of the recent waves of radicalization we've seen in European contexts in particular, associated with the Islamic State and its relationship to online media, which I think is transforming quite quickly. And you'll kind of see as we run through some of our analysis that really what characterizes a lot of this shift is towards more unofficial media outlets, towards more user-generated content, and less kind of one-way central media apparatus that was perhaps associated with the Islamic State of 7, 8, 10 years ago, and instead a much more sort of organic, sort of grassroots-based online ecosystem, which is highly tied to offline radicalization. So first of all, just to start off with the kind of state of the state, if you like, as we heard earlier, the Islamic State is able to maintain a resilient online ecosystem, 6, 7 years after passing its territorial height in the Middle East. This is an interconnected network of mainstream social media outlets, alternative tech platforms, websites, and is a highly connected ecosystem, much like how ordinary internet users will operate across platforms. Of course, terrorists do the same. At the core of this are almost 100 active and partially defunct unofficial media outlets. So we've really transitioned from a kind of official media ecosystem through to something that's much more unofficial in how it's composed, in that it's instead it's a sort of group of support accounts and support outlets, which at various times ally with one another, war with each other, and are part of a sort of vibrant and dynamic online ecosystem, which transitions each and every day. And at IC, we've been tracing these outlets for the best part of a decade now. Now, one sort of offline trend, which I think is really important to recognize, and many of this room will, of course, be aware of, is really the kind of trend towards minors being convicted of terrorist offences, particularly in the wake of the October 7th attack. There's been a sort of steady drumbeat, really, over the past year and a half of convictions of younger and younger individuals. In 2024, 42 minors in Europe were under the age of 18 were arrested for being involved in ISIS-linked attacks, attack planning, or being at the heart of propaganda operations, according to the Washington Institute's analysis on the topic. Now, 25 of these minors were connected online and were in the final stage of preparing simultaneous attacks on at least 5 European cities. And really at the heart of so many of these cases is a deeply online component. It's individuals connected into online networks that are operating across platforms and that are not just planning and engaging in acts of violence, but are also highly a part of a kind of vivid online ecosystem of user-generated content that's involved in planning attacks and coordinating activities and sharing content linked to the unofficial digital ecosystem of the Islamic State. So just as a case study of this, there was a case in Besançon in France of a 12-year-old boy who had downloaded more than 1,700 jihadist videos to his computer and phone, created jihadist characters in video games. I mean, these are sort of similar images to Jess's presentation last time around. Managed 6 accounts across 6 platforms, pumping out jihadist content, really creating a kind of engine of content creation, and regularly conversed with jihadists on Telegram and other messaging applications. Obviously, the kind of youth of this individual is what's particularly concerning, but really the output is quite extraordinary and kind of speaks to a much more sort of user-centered kind of dynamic. There was another case that I was just scribbling down as well, of a 14-year-old who was arrested in Austria for stabbing an Orthodox Jewish man in the street, who was highly entwined in an online ecosystem known as Islamogram, which is something that ISD has investigated previously, and Mustafa and Alex have written about together, which is an online community that blends Salafi ideas with alt-right references and cultural references, as well as many of the gaming subcultural references that Jess was talking about, into a sort of hybridized ideology, which is obviously particularly attractive and appealing to younger people. We've been hearing earlier this morning about the kind of fuzzier borders and the challenge in sort of establishing clear ideological motives. And really, this is at the heart of many of the cases that we see here, despite these individuals associating with Islamic State, even if just informally. So this cross-platform ecosystem, you can, this is a lot of text, but it just provides a bit of a summary of this kind of very interconnected online world that Mustafa's research really focused on. And you can find this all on the next slide. I provide the name of the report, and you can find that on the ISD website. But really, it's a interconnected cross-platform network of support for ISIS, which encompasses websites on the open web, which are linked to ISIS support groups. They function really as aggregators for channels and content, archives and forums. and drive significant engagement with hundreds of thousands of global viewers. We have a number of accounts and pages on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, and we'll kind of go through some of these in terms of the unique role they play within this ecosystem for content creation and online activity, as well as across a number of different messaging apps: WhatsApp, Telegram, Element, as well as operating on X, where actually they notably were taken down quicker than on the other platforms when flagged. So, really what we heard about some of the resilience of these networks. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about how these ecosystems are able to evade moderation. We've already heard about some of the language challenges that have particularly mainstream platforms are facing in terms of moderation. Really, we're seeing the proliferation of this content in an almost kind of language agnostic way in Kurdish, in Pashto, in Somali, in Amharic, Russian, Filipino, and Indonesian. And indeed, Amharic is an example of a language that almost it's known by those who are looking to sort of test the fences of content moderation as being one that's particularly challenging from both a human reviewer perspective, but also from an automated classification perspective. The text of Amharic is incredibly difficult to classify and has actually been used as a sort of code for using English language versions of Amharic script in order to get around content moderation. So as Alex said, it's the mixture of sort of low budget hacks, but also quite sort of sophisticated attempts to bypass online content moderation. So just flicking through some of the sort of specific roles of platforms within this ecosystem. So on TikTok, I'm just going to use the case study of the response to the New Orleans attack over the new year, which killed 15 people and injured scores of others. So here we saw networks on TikTok pop up with pro-ISIS support accounts, and we see here AI-generated images, which obviously we've spoken about previously, including posting a video from a multiplayer game called Multiplayer Car Parking for Syrian supporters, which features a truck similar to the one used in the attack. These videos were kind of generating tens of thousands of views, and indeed one post featured the attacker's face over in a sheet, which generated around 30,000 views. Often the sounds that are used in these videos are kind of at the core of their shareability. People use the sounds function to sort of find other videos that are similar. Quickly on Facebook, which remains a prominent center for activity for unofficial outlets of these kind that we're talking about here, which this kind of content is able to be surfaced through keyword searches, for example, for names of Islamic State leaders. This has previously really been focused on public pages to reach large numbers of followers, but we're seeing increasingly this shifting towards the use of public profiles, which often adopt a specific emoji code in order to use coded language to sort of communicate attack plans and update on news from the Islamic State. And then finally, the role of messaging apps, which are sort of really the network resilience features of this network, which these kind of groups are able to fall back on. So a range of different messaging apps are used here: Telegram, WhatsApp, and Element. They all play a role in directing communications across these more mainstream platforms, but also are essentially fallbacks for both more egregious content, including instructional content around explosives and drones, as well as material that is more likely to be taken down across platforms, but are really used to regroup when you see network takedown attempts on the mainstream platforms themselves. I'm going to just finish off with, given the focus on AI earlier today, just a few kind of case studies of examples of AI content popping up in these kind of unofficial pro-ISIS support networks. We see Gen AI tools being leveraged for propaganda purposes, including creating voiceovers for posters and newsletters, the kind of language ability that, of course, generative AI tools can provide so ubiquitously, being used to generate voiceovers for videos in English, French, and Spanish, which are then spread across platforms. And much of this was originally iterated on the audio platform Clubhouse, so you see kind of trials happening on specific places and then rolled out in other contexts as well. And then, as you can see on this slide here, you've seen attempts to kind of incorporate imagery that sort of echoes the style and aesthetic of ISIS official propaganda, which calls for attacks on law enforcement and popular venues like bars. So I'll leave it with that. Happy to answer any questions or direct them to Mustafa, the true expert on these issues. But hopefully this provides a bit of an overview of how these kind of unofficial supporter networks are kind of becoming part and parcel of a much more blurry online, offline radicalization pathway. Thank you.
Thanks, Milo. I have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. Also, for those of you online, do feel free to send in your questions. Just as we get our questions ready here in the audience, we have a couple up already. I just want to ask Clara on the online misogyny question and where politics comes in. Do you get a sense of the politics of these individuals? I mean, there's discussions around whether or not they're, this could be considered sort of versions of right-wing extremism. Joe Whitaker here has written a bit with Will Costello on incel politics kind of being sort of actually surprisingly not as right-wing as what some may expect. I think of people like Myron Gaines on his podcast, ultra-conservative types as well. You'd have to classify some of them as right-wing, but do you have any thoughts on the kind of the political question with these guys?
Yeah. So the political question actually is really interesting because in one sense, there is a lot of apoliticalness to it all, especially in in three of these categories: the mental health, loneliness, the motivation, grind, encouragement, and the dating one is quite apolitical. But then the financial advice kind of niche, when I studied those accounts, so I generally studied them for a week, and alongside those accounts, I actually got a lot of kind of far right or more right-wing leaning content, in part because a lot of these influencers are often older white men who will generally vote more conservative, Republican, right-wing, the whole don't take my money, I don't want to be taxed type of narratives. But then at the same time, if we were talking kind of more the kind of religious politics of it all, tying it back to more terrorism type of narratives, there were elements that definitely had some white supremacy type of politics. But I did also encounter some accounts that actually leaned more towards jihadist terrorism and kind of building links of with Islamic religions as well. So it was kind of just sometimes it's apolitical, sometimes there's a mixture of everything, which in a way also shows just how generalized this kind of ideology is becoming, where it doesn't really matter what your political stance is. You're just as vulnerable to some of these concepts as your neighbor and someone who might be on the complete opposite side of the spectrum to you.
Thanks. Ryan, did you have anything to add to that? Yeah, go ahead, guys. Oh, yeah, sorry, Jessica. Yeah, please.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
I just was going to say, this is also something that I've looked at. I was really interested to hear Clara's presentation. Is something that I've looked at some as well. But I think we tend to forget when we think about far right and Islamists, we think about them as opposites. So we tend to forget they actually both fall at the far right end of the political spectrum, right? In the sense of conservative views and conservative values. And I think that often gives them that crossover that's necessary to use masculinities, to use misogyny as a through line, and they find connection in that. And that's where you see some of this weird connection of far right and Islamist ideology becoming a thing now, white jihadism, all of this. And I think a lot of it is due to the misogyny that is present in both of them. So I often talk about misogyny as this important through line that we need to see between. But I think if you look back to the 1970s and the sort of the terrorism of then, that was a very much more left wing, I would say. That tended to be much less focused on, I think, the gender roles, the gender role expectations that are very present in today's often sort of right wing and spectrum terrorism.
Yeah, sort of shared right-wing reactionary politics from both. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, me again. John from Ofcom again. So I guess this is potentially maybe somewhat dramatic is maybe the wrong word, but this is in relation to the depiction of violence in video games, right? So I agree, there's lots of evidence to suggest that it's not indicative of real world violence. Like, I played lots of GTA and I like to believe I'm a particularly non-violent person, but do you think that this sort of increasing realism of games, think like Unreal Engine, is going to maybe increase that risk? Like, we know, for example, Anders Breivik used video games to sort of psych himself up, for lack of a better word, in the lead up to the Oslo attacks. So where that violence is maybe becoming more realistic in the depiction in games, do we think that's maybe going to be a concerning sort of on-ramp towards more tacit acceptance of violence? Or is the evidence suggesting that actually it's, even though depicted more realistically, that actually the impact is still fairly hard to predict? I realize that wasn't the best word, but I hope you got what I was getting at.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I would say sort of going back to the 90s, right? Columbine's the first sort of gamified attack. And that was when everybody started asking, does video game violence cause violence? And I think the causal line does not exist, right? Because 3 billion people play video games, many of them very violent video games. Only a few of them are going to go on to commit heinous attacks of violence. So I think the desensitization question is an important question. And there are, you know, not causative, but there are contributory factors where you can see that people, as they start consuming more and more violent content, and also the more violent content also pools in places in the internet where it then pools with, you know, child sexual exploitation content, animal violence, all of these things. When you get into that space, then I think the desensitization question is an important one. And many times now when we talk about gamification of attacks, the concern is that by gamifying attacks, you make them more shareable, because a real life violent attack looks like a game. So people share it. Some people may not even realize that it is actually a real life attack, but as they share it more, as it is exposed to more and more people, then it reduces the reality of your brain processing the fact that these are real humans dying in the real world, and it makes it seem more and more like a game. And that's the issue, I think, where we really need to think about is this gamification of real life violence mixing badly with what are just violent video games, and then enabling an environment that really reduces people's, you know, threshold to want to go out and commit that type of violence in real life.
Thank you. We'll go with Charlie here up at the front, and while she's asking, there's a cluster of questions here. We might as well get the mic down. There's a gentleman there in the checked shirt. If you get it down to him, and he'll pass it down. There's a couple others, but we'll go with you second, sir. Yep. Go ahead, Charlie.
Thank you, and thanks for such great presentations. This question's mainly for Milo, but I'm sure others might have some thoughts on it as well. I just want to ask, what is your kind of protocol for flagging some of this content to platforms? Obviously, I'm sure when you identify like threats to life, you would escalate that to law enforcement. But when it's stuff that kind of clearly violates platforms' policies, that's then staying online while you're conducting all of this research, is there any point you're escalating it? And is that something you would look into kind of expanding in the future?
That's now what
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I think that it's a great question. Essentially, as you say, threat to life, we have kind of internal protocols around. I think it is, we always try to flag this stuff, and it's a really important part of understanding, you know, kind of the resilience of these ecosystems to do so, and to sort of also test the efficacy of the flagging processes and so on across different platforms. And now with new digital regulation in that kind of mandates, you know, for example, the flagging of content that is illegal under the TCO or the DSA at a European level, you know, kind of there's questions around how fit for purpose those tools are and how they're rolled out by platforms. And yeah, I think so. Essentially, like as a part of the research, I think kind of looking at the resiliency of these networks, despite reporting them in, either using platform tools or going straight to platforms, is a really important part of the equation. So yeah, absolutely.
Anyone want to add to that? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
If you talk right into it, is the green light on?
Yeah.
Well, if you just speak up, the acoustics are good enough. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I found that really interesting topic. I just wanted to ask about cycles as well, which is kind of organisations which are doing online nothing or specifically to offline audiences, but either mobilise within or to demonstrate and amplify their existing activism. I just wanted to know whether you see this in your areas of focus. I know the highest on the Irish Firelight, for example, as well, with the British Firelight during the riots last week.
So what kind of organizations are you talking about?
Yeah, so I guess it's you're seeing kind of like increases of organizations like active groups, for example, where they're trying to kind of extend their presence into themselves to mobilize at that level of improve networks. I just wanted to know whether we're seeing that kind of
across the European context, what we've been in place of like Manosphere in South Africa, where you see attacks those kind of offline as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a really great question. Yeah, so to use the example of the Southport riots, where we saw, kind of some of the most dramatic mobilization among far-right extremist groups in this country for decades, one notable piece of our analysis was looking at essentially the entryism of these kind of more hardline far-right groups within broader online communities. And a lot of that is a bit of a function of how platforms themselves are structured. So, for example, Telegram was at the core of a lot of that mobilization. And there were these large existing groups that were kind of quite community oriented and quite locally grounded, that were able to pop up very quickly using a lot of the existing infrastructure from anti-lockdown movements during COVID, and really were able to sort of resuscitate some of these networks. And during COVID, we saw, and you mentioned, the work that we've done on the Irish far right, we saw a consistent attempt to try and essentially weaponize these perhaps conspiratorial groups, perhaps ones asking questions around, government overreach and so on, with kind of specifically ethno-nationalist, supremacist ideology. And I do think that is a bit of a function of how, of how the platforms in these online ecosystems operate, is that there's an ability to try and sort of insert themselves within these spaces and to try and quite literally radicalize them at a community level. So Southport, we saw that happening very quickly. We saw the kind of deliberate attempt to try and get people out onto the streets at a local level. We saw the splintering of these groups into very local ones, the sort of so-called Southport Wake Up network that mobilized incredibly quickly and was really motivated by kind of far-right extremists with a specific ideological agenda. And they were the ones that really translated this into acts of offline violence, like the attacking of asylum hotels and sort of acts of violence against police. So I think that's exactly the right way of thinking about it.
And I'll just say, my response certainly isn't like Milo's. We've collected data on Telegram channels, active clubs, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and very preliminary findings are also suggesting that local matters. Local groups are trying to encourage others, not just the ideological stuff, but pushing stickering campaigns, getting together at the gym, getting together for different types of events. And there's very little research in this space, empirical research, to make those claims, but some of the earlier work that we did, we found that similarly as well. I mean, the online connects to the offline and vice versa. But more contemporarily, I can't really say much now because we just started analyzing the data, but we are seeing that local level connection of folks trying to mobilize others within the community. And maybe even within the state to get together offline. Whatever that looks like is up to that group.
Yeah, and just to kind of actually follow up on your point, so you definitely in the masculinist space have these kind of going to the gym together and things like that. But what I found what's interesting is, at least in what I've seen so far, you have a very heavy, almost class type of element to it, where they'll get together, but they'll get together in Bali or in some really expensive hotel on like male-only trips, meant to bro out shirtless and work out and develop your investment platform. But in that, there's really this financial element of, if you're joining the trip, you have a certain level of wealth or a certain aspiration of wealth behind that. You're not seeing like sad loser incels being like, oh, we're just gonna meet up and hate about women. It's we're gonna meet up and discuss our money and how we need to find the one, and she can't like exploit us for our money type thing. So in that space, there's this really interesting financial class element to it, but I don't know if it exists in other type of local community settings, but it kind of sets this barrier to who's allowed to enter at the same time, which is a weird contrast, I guess.
And then one point, I think it's worth saying too, when we think about, it's worth saying too, when we think about community, that it's a really challenging concept, but I think we have to force ourselves to stop the feeling that the offline community is somehow a tighter knit, more localized, more accessible community. I know for some it definitely is, but there are people now, right? People who have been raised in an entirely online world, and their online life is like I said, is more real to them than their offline life. And they would find a local community space in an online space of whatever flavor that would mean just as much to them as going to the bros gym to work out with the white supremacists. So I think it is also about us challenging, and this is difficult for security actors, to challenge your sense of what you think community is and the meaning that it holds, and whether that online, offline distinction is necessary for all cases.
Thanks. We have the working mic on this side, the same row, gentleman there in the white, and then the same row again, lady there in the coat.
Hi there, Sam Stockwell from the Alan Turing Institute. Thank you very much, all of you, for some great presentations. We're going to be doing some research this year, essentially understanding the role of generative AI and trying to, on the one hand, incite individuals to violence, whether that's, for example, trying to carry out a terrorist attack, but then also looking how in the aftermath of security incidents, how AI generated mis and disinformation could then be used to further encourage people to mobilise violence, similar to what we were just discussing with the Southport case. And we've been kind of noticing a sort of worrying rise in some cases where chatbots have actually been used within this context. So some of you might remember the incident with the guy with the crossbow who tried to assassinate the late Queen, where he was chatting to a female chatbot that was encouraging him to do this. Last week we had the attack in Finland as well, where the individual had put in his manifesto that he had supposedly used ChatGPT to help him plan the attack. I just kind of wanted to get reflections, kind of open-ended question, whether one of you or all of you wanted to sort of respond to it, about whether you see this kind of AI chatbot element as a new threat within that kind of online-offline nexus, transforming or inciting people to carry out violence, or whether it's just kind of one additional tool, whether that's alongside gaming, social media influencers and others. Is it kind of something we should be really concerned about, or actually just another one of these tools basically that is kind of taking a holistic approach? Thanks.
Thank you. If you don't mind passing it down as well, and while that happens, go ahead, Clara, you want to go?
So your point about the chatbot is really interesting. I think a couple months ago, actually, a young boy basically, unfortunately killed himself because he was having a relationship with his chatbot, and obviously there were pre-existing concerns, and the chatbot didn't flag it and things like that. But in the context of a manosphere, when you have these AI girlfriends, essentially, I think it is a genuine major threat, because already we're seeing these kind of tensions. We see it politically in how people vote. We see it in, classrooms and how young boys and girls are interacting with each other. There's already these stark divisions that I think do have a role to play in just how young people are socializing online nowadays. Not to be all like, oh, it's all about the phones, but I do think that, there are elements where there is this kind of gendered gap emerging. And if you're giving these young boys and young girls as well, these kind of first romantic experiences where the chatbot is just there for them and only to please them, and they never hear no, or they never get challenged on that thing, then you're constructing these ideas of the other where the other is entirely submissive to you. And then once you encounter a real person and you get your real first girlfriend, I think there is definitely potential to at least have a certain level of tension where it's like, well, why would I respect you when my AI girlfriend will do everything that I want? And then that does, I think, open some concerning doors. Do I think that AI kind of partners will lead to mass murder and things like that? I don't think so, but I think there are definitely concerning pathways in how it reinforces some pre-existing concerns that we're seeing right now amongst young men and young people in general.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I was particularly interested in the Finland case as well, because I think it was almost the kind of normality of integrating that into the research planning phase of an attack. I think, it's very familiar to researchers of exactly how that process goes. And, you previously had programs that were looking at concerning search terms, for example, on search engines that were kind of looking at mapping that trajectory as someone, goes from ideological formation to sort of operational planning, looking for inspiration. And I think those are all things that can be provided in the right circumstances by an LLM. The way I think kind of as you broke down the kind of inciting element, we had a conversation earlier about kind of whether an AI can be considered to be a user or an individual, and I think it's a lot of this is kind of quite basic stuff that won't be surprising to anyone in this room around the red teaming of these services and providing kind of proper safety by design built into them. But I think in many ways it's going to be difficult to get to the exact kind of safety protocols that are going to be required to stop the kind of relatively low level types of attacks that we're seeing. I mean, in the case of Finland, the models seemingly kind of provided him with just a range of steps that he needed to take in order to kind of maximize his violence in order to reach an exact threshold where I think he wanted to be locked up for 3 years or something. And again, it's one thing training these models to be able to, look for people looking to create ricin or to kind of, understand, how a major terrorist attack was happening. But if it's kind of almost sort of more banal and administrative, it becomes very, very challenging when the kind of context of that violence isn't necessarily clear. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. And just as a bit of a footnote to that, this individual also apparently was very involved in gaming spaces and was again creating using a tool called, I think it's called Gorebox, which kind of allows the reproduction of mass shootings and of gore-based events. And I think this is something we're seeing more and more happening, is coming to Jess's point about gamification of this violence. For minors, the ability to kind of reduce these horrific acts of violence to kind of quotidian, mundane things and to sort of reproduce them and share them very widely online. Again, this is very, very easy to find across social media platforms, this kind of content, which just really flattens mass shootings into like a Minecraft environment or, this kind of like very like a juvenile kind of aesthetic. And so not directly related to the Gen AI tool, but I think kind of part of that same conversation around the kind of tools that you're using in the context of planning those effects.
I think the key word that you used that sort of sparked me thinking was incitement, because I think this is a really interesting question and one, because AI is ultimately feeding you back what you're asking for. So, and it's also being influenced by all of the horrible things that exist on the internet that it's learning from and whoever is teaching it and what they're teaching it. But it's fundamentally feeding you back what you ask for. So I think this question of, is it considered a tool that helps you more quickly and accessibly get to the information that you want? Or is it a tool that is actually inciting people to violence? And I think that's the nuance where we will eventually have to think about the legal responsibility around AI. And unless it is, there are terrorist produced games, and I imagine there will, be terrorist produced chatbots that are purposefully put on the internet to radicalize people, but that will touch the minority, right? The majority are going to use these tools in ways that are going to be relatively easy to get around the safeguards that are in place if you're asking low-level type of questions. So I think that's the fundamental nuance that maybe we need to think about for the future.
Thank you. Just time for one last question. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, this is Lucy. I am from the Institute of World Politics in DC, but also studying at the University of Oxford. I loved that the panel today discussed the intersection of cultural, demographic and identities, as well as mental health, social inclusion, and youth development, all of which are associated with human behavior, philosophy, and psychology. If applicable to you, can you share some of the broader psychological, philosophical concepts and phenomenons, and also specific thinkers that might have inspired your research?
I guess I'll just say what inspired my research. So I didn't have time to get into it, but these projects I've been presenting on about these violent and non-violent right-wing extremists, I was able to collect a data set from working with former extremists who I had become quite close with actually, but who were also able to look through lists of usernames based on where these formers were active online and pinpoint whether they're violent or non-violent in the offline space. I was particularly interested in that at the time because 10 years ago, we were having these conversations about being able to actually identify violent users. We still really have no understanding of intent. But the short of it was I was able to work with people who were formerly involved in violent extremism, who had particularly interesting insight into people who made up these online communities and how it could help researchers and by extension, practitioners and policymakers in identifying potentially credible threats. In terms of philosophical and psychological, perhaps the next speakers can chat about that. Thank you.
So for me, the inspiration for this research is obviously my PhD, which actually focuses a lot more on algorithms. And it was a question then of, well, which algorithms and then which communities, because obviously the impact of algorithms is just massive. And so part of it was because when I started my PhD, Andrew Tate is still very much a hot topic. And then more personally, I have two younger brothers and the youngest one is now 18. And so when I started, he was just peak Andrew Tate audience, kind of target audience. And it was very interesting because both of them would be very joking about Andrew Tate and they'd kind of quote him, but at the same time in a way that was, well, he's funny, but we don't believe him. And I was like, well, you might not, but I'm sure that there's people in your friend group when you joke who definitely do believe some of these jokes and these quotes and things like that of, you know, walk in like you own the place. And so that for me was really this moment where I was like, well, this does impact people around me. And I'm sure it impacts, you know, a lot of people around all of you as well. And that was really the motivation to really focus on the manosphere was like, if my own family members are being impacted, then I'm sure so many people are as well. And there was at the time, at least, a bit of a lack of discussion. Obviously, Netflix has changed that. But I think, yeah, it was kind of a more personal side to a very professional approach. And then philosophically, I would say that there's definitely kind of influences of, because of the algorithm of like Foucault and Deleuze and like how we construct a person and how we construct identity. Very French approach to it all. But yeah, that's kind of the general side of things.
Thanks. Yeah, I did a philosophy degree and I'm not sure I can answer your question around philosophical influences. One person I will shout out is the great J.M. Berger, who I think has just been incredibly influential in driving a lot of the thinking around these issues. I think that early definitional work around extremism is something that's not just a relational concept, but something that is, you know, a kind of inherent phenomena that is, you know, rooted in social identity and kind of coming to this notion of community, in groups, out groups, and kind of essentially the kind of supremacy that is at the heart of all of these worldviews, whether they manifest violently or non-violently. I think it's just been an incredibly kind of powerful idea that has really stretched across the kind of shift that we've seen in this field from like 10 years ago, everyone focused on foreign fighters and ISIS, to suddenly the far right was a thing, and then everyone was looking at like COVID conspiracies. And I think just the kind of versatility of that framework and really kind of drilling down on what we're talking about as harms that are not just about like a very small subset of violent radicalization and terrorism, but rather the broader impacts of all of these trends on democracy, on community, on the individual from a psychological perspective, I think is just like a very powerful thought to have, and I kind of go back to a lot. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I think it's difficult to give a particular shout out because there's so many people that have influenced this discussion, but I think it's really important that we're seeing now more attention being paid to sort of taking the learnings from different spaces and applying them to this one, because I think for a long time counterterrorism was gender blind, we could say, right? Like for a long time there was very little consideration of these intersectional human dynamics to what we're looking at now, and I'm really happy to see that there's more and more people bringing this sort of the lenses that we need to look at, and remembering that even if we're talking about online spaces, we're talking about people in those online spaces, and the internet is a tool that is wielded. It is, you know, so to understand all of these identity factors, I think is something that has slowly built up capacity in the counterterrorism or countering extremism space, but there's a lot of people to thank for doing that. So I think it's difficult to highlight one, but there's certainly a lot of influences that are coming from the adjacent fields and adjacent spaces that have really contributed, I think, to the robustness of the research in this space.
Thanks all. I suppose one thing that's worth to answer your question, a lot of the ideas that we're talking about here today and the politics, they're not that new. They're repackaged, modernized versions of ideas that have been around for a while. So, you know, things like the history of ideas, intellectual history. Oxford has a pretty good program on that. I think one of the places where that began, people like Lovejoy inspired himself by Voltaire. So if you want to sort of, if you're interested in that part of it and contextualizing what we're dealing with today and understanding its appeal, that's a pretty useful approach. So we'll leave it at that. We're going to have some concluding remarks from Julian. Just a few more minutes. We'll ask you to stick around. Your name tags, if you don't mind, either you can leave them on the table there where you are or hand them to our conference assistants here. And thanks again to the panelists. You guys can go ahead and disembark. And Julian, a few minutes from, thank you.
Microphone. Is that a microphone? No.
Thank you very much. This is actually going to be very short. I just wanted to thank all the panelists for the fantastic discussion. It was great to hear fascinating insight on the latest trending extremist use of emerging technology and the real world impact. It was also great to hear about some new tools that could help us in our work. This conversation will certainly help inform GNET's future direction. Thank you all for attending. Please feel free to reach out to us if you would like to contribute to GNET. We're always on the lookout for our insight contributors. We're talking about pieces of research of 1,500, 2,000 words. If you have any idea to submit, please reach out to our commissioning editor and project manager, Belle Riley Thompson, at mail@gnet-research.org. Thank you very much. Ben and I are going to stick around a little if you would like to come and chat with us. Thank you.